Hello and welcome. My name is Heath Jones, and this is the Northwood Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Northwood Christian Church, located in Indianapolis, Indiana, with more than a little help from All Indiana Podcast Network. If you'd like to learn more about us, please visit our website at www.indynCC, that's INDYNCC.org, or check us out on Facebook by searching for Northwood Christian Church. If you'd like to learn more about All Indiana Podcast Network, please visit their site at www.allindianapodcastnetwork.com and check out the various podcasts that they host, all of which are from Indiana. Now, periodically, there will be advertisements during this podcast, and these are added later after I've sent out the recording. And I don't know what ad you'll hear or when they'll arrive exactly, but just to avoid confusion, I want you to know that they are coming. That being said, it's been several weeks since we've put out a new podcast, and this has been for several reasons, kind of working alongside one another all at once. For one, and perhaps the most pressing reason, it's a busy time of year for pastors like myself. It's Easter, or just after Easter, and if you think it's over on Easter Day, not even close. We begin to hash out the themes of Easter and what life looks like on the other side of an empty tomb. And so I've been very busy. But alongside that, the topics that we've touched on in our church haven't been topics that I've wanted to podcast about, quite frankly. They didn't seem to bridge well to, what I have in mind for this podcast. And so to fill you in on what we have been talking about, we've been having sort of an in-house discussion amongst ourselves about Christian unity, unity between different denominational bodies and different individuals. And the first week, we talked about how unity is holy and sacred and worthy of our pursuit just because it is such a beautiful vision for what humanity might look like when brothers and sisters in humanity work alongside one another in harmony and in love, and not in spite of our differences, but with our differences interwoven and highlighted and celebrated. And so unity and diversity. And that was the first week. And then last week, we talked about what it might look like for our own local church, Northwood Christian Church, to start small with the petty squabbles and then work up from there. But this week, I think that today's discussion may have a wider appeal, or I at least want you to know, if you're listening to this and are not a churchgoer or a Christian, I want you to know that there are Christians who are thinking along these lines, because in a world that is so divided, oftentimes religion plays a key part in those divisions, and I just want you to know that here is one pastor who is hoping to live into my Christian witness in a way that is not divisive or destructive to the communities around me. In fact, I would like to live into it in a way that is life-giving to all of those around me, of whatever tribe, race, religion, sexual orientation, you name it. I want to be a source of life and hope to all persons. And so that being said, I'd like to read to you a few short verses from the book of Romans, written by the Apostle Paul. And we'll read from the 11th chapter, verses 33 through 36, which go, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him, to receive a gift in return? For from him, and through him, and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." More on that in just a second, but first I'd like to ask you a question. If you were to draw a picture of God on paper, what would it look like? Impossible, you may say, and you'd be right. It's not even a sophisticated take anymore to point out that God is not that bearded white guy in the clouds, arms stretched out, touching the finger of Adam on the roof of the Sistine Chapel, and yet that angry old man that was etched into my child's mind when I was young still visits me from time to time. That's what I thought about when I thought about God, an angry old man with a long beard. I'm being quite literal, that's what I thought, and I wonder how that picture got put into my head, and I can see him now. But we grow up, and as we do, we continue to picture what God is like, but we start to use words instead of pictures, and we start to differentiate between different attributes of God. Notice I've been talking about God using the male pronoun him when God is not gendered. You may well say she and be correct or incorrect if God transcends gender. But either way, we try to figure it out, and we read and we write down our theologies and we grasp from metaphors, which is about as close to drawing God as we can manage as we grow older. And some admit, in humility, that the task is impossibly hard. But others exude far more confidence and even claim to have gotten God right, at least on paper, or at least on the important matters. God on paper. I'd like to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. What I mean by that is that it's the best descriptions of God written down, our best efforts. And church history is filled with persons who have sought to get God right on paper, writing down scriptures and creeds and systematic theologies. And as soon as the ink dries, it seems that someone else will surely produce a rival document, one that explains why the other person's paper God is surely wrong and their own is surely right. And they will even have their reasons stated emphatically. And when this happens in church communities, there might be a split. New movements are formed, denominations. I'd like to read a paragraph from Britannica.com, as in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it writes this of a schism, that is a separation that happened about 1,000 years ago, the schism of 1054. And it reads, "The greatest schism in church history occurred between the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Rome. While 1054 is the symbolic date of the separation, the agonizing division was 6 centuries in the making and the result of several different issues. The Eastern Church sharply disagreed when the Western Church introduced into the Nicene Creed the doctrine that the Holy Spirit proceeds not from the Father alone, as earlier church fathers had taught, but from the Father and the Son." And their word for that in the Latin was filioque. And I just got to say, how would one even begin to know which of those two options were true? And in the end, what difference does it make? At least that's my feelings in this moment. And it seems so abstract to us today, but it mattered back when. And for some, it still matters. So I don't want to walk on too thin of ice here, but there's the problem. These divisions make you feel like you're walking on thin ice around the other. And I'm trying to wonder what it might look like for things to be different. Either way, the church in the East and the church in the West remain split to this day. But as the above quoted article alluded to, the divisions were by then already centuries old. And the more I've studied the history, the more I've come to the mindset or become convinced that these divisions have had less to do with beliefs about God and more to do with power. Perhaps our descriptions of God on paper have more to do with power, an idea to toy around with or to consider. But hear me first before I move on. Beliefs about God do matter. I do believe that. There are beliefs about God that cause real harm and others that lead to life. But many of our divisions along doctrinal lines are not about theology. And if you've watched Christians argue about these things from the outside, I want you to know that I don't think that these arguments, if they have been perplexing to you, why do they care so much about it? I don't know that they're always about theology, although those are where the battle lines are drawn. I mean to say, as I mentioned last week, do you really believe that a Protestant or a Catholic in Northern Ireland ever threw a pipe bomb into a pub because they could not agree about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or about the place of the Virgin Mary in the cosmic hierarchy? I mean, come on. No, I think these doctrinal lines become placeholders for the tribal identifiers that help people's intention with one another determine who's in and who's out. And we will always get it wrong to varying degrees, especially when our doctrines are about keeping others out. I think you go wrong from the very first step when that is perhaps the underlying motive. And it is in the context of a divided, fragmented world that 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul writes the following words: "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable God's ways." And I love that. If you're trying to get God right on paper, these words call you to a deeper humility in regards to this enterprise. God's decisions and ways are described as unsearchable and inscrutable. You can never quite grasp them or even maybe come very close. Maybe closer, but not closest. And then Paul combines portions of Isaiah and Job and writes, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor?" It's as if to say, you just can't know, so pump the brakes. Proofread your theological treatises and read what you've written with a great deal of humility, if not skepticism. What did you think that you'd do? Did you think you'd wrap your mind around the ways, personality, and existence of the one of whom it is said, "From God and through God and to God are all things"? It's as if to say, look around you. All that is, was, and will be, the whole of the created order and the nature of existence already is confounding enough. Did you think that you'd write the authorized biography of the one who called it all into being? And some theologians say, yes. And I think that there's a great deal of hubris in that. But we try. We try and get it right. But as I said before, I suspect that our efforts have far more to do with our impulse towards tribalism than we'd like to admit, which is what makes today's passage still more on point. Who's in and who's out? This has been an underlying question in religious communities, perhaps from the very start. And this question of who's in and who's out is this text's backdrop, the context for these words for this Bible passage. They come after. The Apostle Paul has used an olive tree as a metaphor to describe God's actions in the world. And here's my summary of Paul's metaphor, and you can read it for yourself if you start at the beginning of chapter 11, where we began, and read on from there. But here's my summary of Paul's thinking on this matter. He says in so many words, God's people are like an olive tree, rooted in God and full of life. And many have tried to keep the tree pure from imperfections, sometimes sin, sometimes, in their mind, the wrong sort of people, which I would say that's sinful. But either way, people have their criteria, and they're wondering who is in the tree, who is out of the tree, who is grafted into the vine, and who is cut off. And then there are others who have cut themselves off from the tree, abandoning God and abandoning life. But when this happened, when some were cut off, others cut themselves off from this life-giving tree, God did something that seemed to the people in those days to be crazy, even reckless. God grafted new wild olive branches into that ancient tree where the broken branches had left scars. New communities were stitched together. New and surprising life was included into the whole, branches, leaves, and fruit that never could have been anticipated. And for Paul, these new branches were, metaphorically speaking, the Gentiles, those who had been outside of the tribes of Israel, people like you and like me, in other words. And as we said last week, we are not used to thinking of ourselves as outsiders. If you are a church-going person or somebody who has been raised in this culture, you may not think of yourself in those terms, at least in relation to the religious communities around us, because they're dominantly Christian. But we were not initially welcomed into these communities. We ate the wrong foods, we kept the wrong rituals, we told different stories, we spoke in different tongues. So for Paul to suggest that the likes of us were grafted into the tree that God was cultivating from the beginning, that we were included among the chosen ones, the people of God, the family of God, in fact, and were named ourselves children of God. Well, this was unthinkable to many. How could God include those who for centuries had not had in mind the things of God, at least so far as they could see? So Paul challenged the church in Rome in this context, with the outsiders and the insiders, and the lines being more or less clearly drawn. Paul challenged that church in Rome with this conviction, that God had made a way for the likes of you and me, and many others besides, that we were to be included in the story. And for some, this was heresy. wrong thinking. While our inclusion was in keeping with several theological/scriptural strains, orders for our exclusion were also written down in the scriptures. And so you had these two messages in tension. So what to do? And many liked the passages that emphasized our exclusion. So what to do? What to think? Well, Paul said, these Gentiles have been grafted into the living tree. He even said that this undertaking was so astonishing, for those who seem surprised by it, so astonishing that it seemed contrary to nature even. He says that in verse 24. In other words, it didn't feel right. Paul even understood how it didn't feel quite right. It can be disorienting when you are becoming used to others with different traditions and backgrounds and ways of being. And this didn't sit well with not a few. And yet it was the work of God. And Paul acknowledged that. This work to include and make a way to include those who before had been on the outside looking in. But it even gets more intense. What of those Israelites who had fell away in the meantime, those branches that had been cut off, who did not respond favorably to God's movement? And here the intuition of not a few has caused them to say, send them to hell. I'm sorry to say that that is a common religious impulse. Not so, says Paul. He said instead, for if you have been cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? That's verse 24 of the 11th chapter. And a few lines later, he says, as regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And if you got lost in the weeds there, in other words, even the alleged enemies of God are beloved and eventually brought back into the fold. How? Who knows? But leave it to God to find a way. And it is precisely after making this point that Paul wrote the words under consideration for today. These words that we began in reading are a response to the inconceivable work that God was doing to bring new kinds of persons in, to include those whose exclusion had been assumed and their inclusion had been considered heretical. After making the point that they will be brought in and become a part of the living tree, and then those who had fallen away will then also become part of the living tree, all. After that astonishing claim. In a world so divided, Paul writes, oh, the depth and the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable God's ways. So just when you think you've got God right on paper, everything you thought you knew is upended. God's mercy turns out to be greater than we ever thought possible. Just when you thought you knew who was in and who was outside of your holy communion, God brings more sons and daughters in. So, as we each in our own way try to put down on paper or commit to thought what we believe God is like, remember that as soon as you think things are coming into focus, some new revelation may well come into focus that changes everything. We must find words to describe our interactions with the divine. There's no getting around that. Humans must use language to communicate, and it helps us crystallize our ideas better than if we had not written them down or spoken them aloud. But remember that they are always and only stand-in symbols for something far from describable. Or in the words that Paul quoted, for who has known the mind of God, or who has been God's counselor? We must not mistake the signs for what they signify. When we do, we create idols. And many of our doctrines, creeds, and descriptions of God have become our idols. Our dividing lines have become our idols, our false gods. And we must put the idols back on the shelves along with our books of theology. They may well contain part of the truth, but not all of the truth. For the community Paul was writing to, we were heretics in every sense. Wrong background, from wrong religious traditions, wrong languages, wrong customs, and we even ate the wrong foods. But God made a way for us, and the hearts of the early Jesus followers in Rome were changed, and we were eventually accepted by those who were merely reflecting the love of God. The God who once made a way for we Gentiles to see ourselves as part of the larger story, and that God is still at work. Who is God wanting to bring in today? In a time where the church keeps so many people out. Sadly, who are we being challenged to include today in the Spirit of God, which I hardly understand? I also believe is at move calling all peoples across traditions together. We must become a part of this work, moving with the Spirit as she calls all persons together. We will share different beliefs about God, true, and some of these differences will be at odds with one another, and some will even cause harm. And Christians must work these things out humbly and gracefully, what we think God looks like on paper. But the God who amazed the Apostle Paul by the boundless scope of God's mercy and saving grace and love will, I believe, astonish us yet again as we are called to a greater unity and a greater love. For from God and through God and to God are all things. Leave it to God to find a way to save it all from the top down. To God be the glory forever. Amen. This has been the Northwood Podcast. As we said earlier, if you want to learn more about Northwood Christian Church, please visit our website, www.indyncc.org, or search for Northwood Christian Church on Facebook. And from those places, you can find our worship times and also our live streams, as we are live streaming during this time of pandemic. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to receive further notice of future episodes. But until the next time, grace and peace be with you. Go in God. Take care.